The whisper of the wheat. In the golden fields of Flanders, where the sun-kissed wheat swayed like a sea of amber, young Margot wiped the sweat from her brow and straightened her aching back. The harvest was in full swing, and every able body in the village, united by a shared tradition, was out among the stalks, their scythes swinging in rhythmic arcs. Margot's eyes wandered to the group, resting beneath the great oak tree at the field's edge. There, nestled among the gnarled roots, sat old Willem, his weathered face creased with a lifetime of harvests. The younger workers gathered around him, eager for a moment's respite, and perhaps a tale from the village's oldest resident. Curiosity tugged at Margot. She glanced at her father, who nodded his silent permission. With a grateful smile, she set down her scythe and went to the oak's welcoming shade. As she approached, Willem's voice carried on the warm summer breeze, and that's when the fairies of the field taught us the secret of the harvest dance. The gathered workers chuckled, but Margot saw a glimmer in Willem's eye that spoke of more than fanciful stories. "Tell us another, Willem," called out young Peter, barely 14 and on his first harvest. The older man's gaze swept across his audience, settling on Margot as she found a spot on the sun-warmed earth. "Ah, young Margot," he said, his voice as rough and warm as bark. "Perhaps you'd like to hear the tale of how this very field came to be." Margot nodded eagerly, feeling the eyes of the group upon her. Willem leaned back against the tree, his gnarled hands resting on his knees. "It was long ago, before your grandparents' grandparents were born. This land was wild then, untamed and full of dark forests where few dared to tread." The workers leaned in, the rhythm of the distant scythes fading into the background. "There was a young man named Joris," Willem continued, "who dreamed of carving out a place for himself in this wilderness. He came with nothing but an axe, a bag of seed, and a heart full of hope." Margot could almost see this Joris, standing at the edge of the great forest, his eyes scanning the untamed land before him. For days, Joris worked from dawn to dusk, felling trees and clearing the land. But the forest was vast, and Joris was but one man. As the moon waxed and waned, he began to despair. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the group. They all knew the backbreaking work of taming the land. Then, one night, as Joris slept beneath the stars, he was awakened by a strange sound. It was like the whisper of wind through wheat, though not a single stalk had yet grown. He opened his eyes to find himself surrounded by tiny, glowing figures. Peter gasped, his young face alight with wonder. Even the older workers leaned in, caught up in the magic of Willem's words. The fairies of the field had come, drawn by Joris's determination and the dreams he'd planted in the freshly turned earth. They offered him a bargain. They would help him clear the land and nurture his crops, but in return, he must promise always to leave a portion of the harvest as an offering, Willem continued, his voice carrying the mystery of the fairies' actions. Willem's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Joris agreed, and from that night on, mysterious help came to him. Trees fell easily, rocks rolled away of their own accord, and his planted seeds sprouted with unnatural speed. Margot held her breath, imagining the wonder Joris must have felt. When autumn came, Joris had a field of wheat as vast and golden as the one we work today. True to his word, he left a portion unharvested, tied into sheaves at the field's edge. Willem paused, his eyes twinkling. "And do you know, to this very day, we still leave those sheaves. Look there, at the edge of the field." Every head turned to where Willem pointed. Sure enough, a line of wheat sheaves stood at the far end of the golden expanse, untouched by scythe or sickle. "But that's for the poor, isn't it?" asked one of the older workers, confusion furrowing his brow. Willem smiled, a secret dancing in his eyes. "Aye, that's what we say now. But have you ever wondered why the harvest is always bountiful, even in the leanest years? Or why our wheat grows taller and stronger than any other in the region?" A thoughtful silence fell over the group. Margot looked at the familiar fields with new eyes, imagining the unseen hands that might be nurturing the crops alongside their own. "Now then," Willem said, clapping his hands together, "that's enough tales for one day. The wheat won't harvest itself, fairies or no fairies. Remember, it's our collective effort and respect for the land that truly brings about the bountiful harvest we enjoy." With good-natured grumbling, the workers began to rise, stretching out muscles stiff from sitting. As Margot stood, Willem caught her eye and beckoned her closer. "Young Margot," he said softly so only she could hear, "tonight, when the moon is high, come to the edge of the field where the sheaves stand. Watch closely, and you might see something wondrous." Margot nodded, her heart racing with excitement and a touch of fear. That night, long after the household had gone to sleep, Margot slipped out of bed and went to the moonlit field. She crouched behind a hedge, her eyes fixed on the shadowy sheaves. For a long while, nothing happened. Then, just as Margot's eyelids grew heavy, she saw a flicker of movement. Tiny lights, no bigger than fireflies, danced around the wheat sheaves. As she watched, breathless with wonder, the lights coalesced into small, translucent figures that flitted from sheaf to sheaf, their laughter like the tinkling of distant bells. Margot blinked, and in that instant the figures vanished. But the memory of their dance remained, etched forever in her mind. Years later, when Margot's hair had turned as white as Willem's, she would sit beneath the old oak tree and tell wide-eyed children about the fairies of the field. And though some would scoff and call it mere fancy, a few would sneak out on harvest nights, hoping to glimpse the magical helpers who blessed their fields. And so, the whisper of the wheat carried on through generations, a secret passed down from old to young, keeping the magic that danced at the edges of their golden world alive.